is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, uncertainty over the 2015 Iran deal. Days after the U.S. Secretary of State visited the Middle East and 10 days before the U.S. President will decide on the deal's fate. Could the agreement still hold? And it's a slam dunk interview with retired NBA star Yao Ming. Yao got his famed face as president of the Chinese Basketball Association. How does he plan to improve the hoops in China? You're watching World Insight. We begin today's program in the Middle East, where some recent events could push the region closer to the edge. On Monday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he has evidence to prove Iran has secretly been working to develop nuclear weapons, which came a day after he met with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Pompeo just wrapped up his quick tour of American Middle East allies ahead of a crucial White House decision on whether to scrap the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, despite many other world powers supporting the deal. Take a look at this.
Keep the Iran nuclear deal or push new sanctions? That is the big question. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made new claims about Iran's nuclear program on Monday. The timing is glaring, a day after U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's visit and 12 days before U.S. President Donald Trump will make the decision either to honor the 2015 Iran nuclear deal or junk it.
After signing the nuclear deal in 2015, Iran intensified its efforts to hide its secret nuclear file.
Iran responded by calling Mr. Netanyahu the boy who cried wolf and slammed the accusations.
Repeated violations of Iran's nuclear deal by U.S. President Trump signify the untrustworthiness of this country in the international scene. If the U.S. restores the sanctions on Iran, the Iranian parliament and society think there's no reason to stay with the Iran nuclear deal.
However, Mr. Pompeo said Israel's newly released package of intelligence was authentic and much of it was new to U.S. experts. Last week, he met with Saudi, Israeli, and Jordan leaders during his 3-day visit to the Middle East and discussed opposition to Iran. U.S. President Donald Trump has been criticizing the nuclear deal since it was signed in 2015 by his predecessor Barack Obama with other world powers.
You know, in 7 years, that deal will have expired and Iran is free to go ahead and create nuclear weapons. That's not acceptable. 7 years is tomorrow.
Last month, French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel had state visits to the U.S. Both of them have agreed the nuclear deal is still the best way to prevent Tehran from having nuclear weapons. The European Union is skeptical of Israel's new claims, pointing out the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, has released 10 reports certifying that Iran has fully complied with its commitments. The world does not have to wait long. The fate of the Iran nuclear deal will be known in less than 2 weeks.
So where is the Iran nuclear deal going? Will Washington still subscribe to it? That's a big question mark. With us to answer that question, helping us to understand the latest information, Beijing, we have Li Guofu, who is a director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Sir, welcome to our program. In Tehran, Iran, we have Gambar Naderi, who is a political analyst and columnist with an international newspaper over there. And in Brighton, I should say, we have Catherine Shakdam, who is a director of Shafakna Institute of Middle Eastern Studies, and in Washington, D.C., U.S., Joe Rubin, president of the Washington Strategy Group, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Welcome to the four of you. I want to start with you, Mr. Nadari, when you heard about the accusation coming from Israel today, with the Prime Minister suggesting that the deal, 2015 Iranian deal, was based on lie, how would you respond to that?
Well, Tianwei, that's a good question. I think Israel is not in a position, let alone its prime minister, to tell us if Iran is in compliance or not. That's not their business. It has everything to do with the IAEA and the IAEA's inspectors that we know so far after signing that deal in 2015, they have come up with 10 reports that made it absolutely clear that Iran has been in compliance from day one. So if you have something, at the end of the day, if you have something, if you are Netanyahu or anyone else, Pompeo, whoever you are, from any country that you are, if you have some damning evidence, if you have it, you are more than welcome to take it to the IAEA for further verification.
So, Mr. Rubin, how should we understand this? That Israel, despite of the fact that the Prime Minister is not capable of presenting any concrete evidence except accusations that the earlier deal was based on lie, and yet the documents, more than 100,000 pages of them, are actually dating back to 2003 when the deal was not the deal yet. That is why there needs to be a deal. So what does it tell us that the Prime Minister of Israel would just come out and present a document like that as if it were all we need as evidence?
Thank you for having me today to discuss this. And you pointed out exactly right, Tian. This is a circular argument that Israel is engaging in. We all know in the United States, the European countries, Russia, China, that negotiated with Iran on the nuclear agreement, we all knew that Iran was engaged in a nuclear weapons development program that was halted and paused. Our intelligence community verified that, but that they did have knowledge, and that is why there were sanctions put on Iran, and there was a negotiation process to get to this nuclear deal. So what's happening now is a demonstration of the importance of this nuclear agreement, of ensuring that Iran's feet are held to the fire, that when there are violations, and there is no accusation of a violation of the nuclear deal currently, not even Israel has said that Iran is violating the current deal. When that does occur, though, then there is a process to bring Iran into compliance. And so it's very concerning right now to see this administration engaging in gamesmanship, frankly, about the nuclear agreement and what it does. These accusations prove that the deal is working.
All right. Ms. Shaknam, the question is now, with the United States, the president saying what he's saying, and the Secretary of State going to this region with Saudi Arabia and Israel, certainly trying to come out as soon as possible to be on the same side with the President of the United States without presenting evidence to support. The question is whether it really matters or not. One has evidence or not. If the United States just decides to walk away.
I think the United States wants to walk away, and it's looking to build a narrative to justify its walking away. And I think that's the problem, because it's not based on facts on the ground. It's only based on allegations. And I think that, Israel is feeding into this narrative that is coming out of Washington. But again, it's a false narrative in the sense that Iran has done nothing wrong. And it's very dangerous when, we're dealing with international law to actually allude to so-called allegations and violations which are just fantasies and are not real and cannot be proven. This is very dangerous, because we're setting a precedent that could be used further down the line against other nations. And I don't think that anyone wants to see the international community being called into a cycle where the allegations of one nation, because it is said to be exceptional, will weigh heavier than facts on the ground or actual realities, political realities. So I think it's very dangerous. It's not just because Iran is involved here. I think it's just it's setting a very dangerous precedent, as I said. And Washington needs to wake up and to stop dealing with, I would say, a kind of it wants to feed into people's fear. It's trying to build a narrative, again, that is so divorced from reality that it's very difficult to have a rational conversation now.
Well, I have to say, Ms. Shakdam, that Washington has woken up, but totally under a very different daylight, I have to say. On the other hand, let me go to you, Ms. Li, about your thought on this. China was one of those signatories to the Iranian nuclear deal. We remember how much efforts it took eventually to get this deal done. And according to IAEA, at least, Iran has been getting rid of its nuclear programs. So, what does it say to China when you read signs like this and debates like this going on elsewhere in the world?
I think, so far I have not heard, the official response from the Chinese government.
Not yet.
But we have heard that the European governments, especially the EU 3 countries, they have said that, what Netanyahu said is something, reinforce the need or the necessity of to preserving the nuclear deal. Because in that way, because of the nuclear deal, the aim is to prevent it, the Iran have a possibility to possessing the nuclear deal. That is exactly the purpose of the nuclear deal.
All right. Let me go to you, Mr. Nadari. I hope the voice works okay now for you. One of the things we need to take a look at is that Iran might become this specimen, the specimen of a precedence the other three guests have talked about. Even though you might not like it, it could happen. As we have seen with many other issues, whether it is trade or the other things going on in the world, that Washington is having a very different attitude these days about how it deals with the rest of the world. I mean, the White House. So, what would that mean to Iranian politics, to the different political opinions going on in Iran regarding how to deal with the rest of the world, regarding how to look at yourself in Iran? Mr. Nadari.
Well, Tianwei, that's the question everybody's asking now. If the Trump White House exceeds this important international agreement, make no mistake, the first thing that will happen in Iran is that our government, the so-called moderate government, will collapse, and it will be replaced by conservatives, the hardliners, who are not in good terms with the United States, are not in the mood to sign any more international agreements with Washington, which we know is no longer trustworthy, and at the same time they will continue vigorously our nuclear program. That includes full enrichment of uranium and resumption of all nuclear activities that we stopped after signing that important deal back in 2015. So make no mistake, Iran is not going to sit on its hands. Iran is not going to confine itself to this nuclear deal that doesn't, by the way, give us any economic benefits, and in fact brings us more sanctions by the United States and its allies. And Iran is not going to do that. Iran will leave the nuclear deal. Iran will leave the NPT. The government here will collapse, and we will have a different picture in places like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and of course Yemen.
Well, Mr. Trump is to decide on May the 12th, likely, whether to reimpose sanctions on Tehran. And he's also going to decide whether there's going to be any deal that he would subscribe to when it comes to Iran. His newly appointed Secretary of State, though, told reporters that Iran was the greatest sponsor of terrorism, quote, in the world, and the nuclear deal cannot stop it from possessing a nuclear weapon, end of quote. That, of course, is what Mr. Pompeo said during his trip to the Middle East. But Mr. Rubin, do you think there will be enough debates in the United States about where to go about the Iranian deal? Are there some forces that is likely to play a significant role in terms of trying to figure out whether there's any evidence coming from the current White House and current administration about the otherwise?
Yes. First and foremost, on Capitol Hill, when Secretary Pompeo was in his confirmation hearings, all the Democrats pushed him very hard about protecting the Iran nuclear deal. In addition, just over the last couple of weeks, Secretary of Defense Mattis has said that he read the deal 3 times and thought that the verification provisions, which are critical, it gives us insight into the Iranian nuclear program and its ongoing activities in this arena. Mattis said that the verification provisions were very strong. So there is some significant support there. In addition to that, the American public, 56% in a poll that just came out this morning, support the nuclear deal, 26% oppose it. So while President Trump did make campaign promises about ending the deal, he will face a backlash here if the United States is seen as breaking a deal that is working and that, again, undermines American credibility on the international diplomatic stage, particularly when we're engaging with North Korea, potentially for another new nuclear deal. So there's a lot at play here, and American politics are not necessarily aligned for President Trump, which is why the Israeli release of information 2 days ago was so critical to understanding how the setup is for potential pullout by the United States on May 12th. Last thing I'll mention is that French President Macron, when he came here, he was very well received in his arguments about the Iran nuclear deal. The opinion community, the national security expert community, does strongly believe that this deal is working despite the problems with Iranian behavior in the region writ large.
Well, even that is being said, Mr. Shakdam, will it matter what the others believe? I mean, the president, to a certain extent, as we have seen over the past few months, demonstrated by the current White House, that once he tries to make a point, he will make a point, even though the collateral damage politically could be big.
Right.
But that's what he's going to do. And it seems in the previous case studies, the other forces in Washington have not yet been able to demonstrate their capabilities. So, Mr. Shakdam, are we going to face this critical moment very soon? Very likely, May the 12th.
It's going to be quite difficult, and I think you're quite right when you're saying that, you know, President Trump so far has only been trying to prove a point, the point being that he wants to be right, and he wants to appear as, you know, as the man who keeps his promises, the kind of promises that he made during his campaign. And I think that's a problem because, again, he's not rooting his decision trying to actually weigh in between, you know, where does the truth lies and whether his partners, for example, Israel and Saudi Arabia, are actually genuine in their wishes for, you know, for peace in the Middle East or to actually collaborate and cooperate with Iran in trying to bring, you know, more stability in the Middle East. So it's very dangerous because, again, we're based in a situation where it's really just, you know, it's almost as if we are caught with the monarch and people are trying to gain his favors. And I'm afraid that Donald Trump is not making decisions based on rationality, but rather his likes and dislikes. And it's rather dangerous when you bear in mind that he's one of the most powerful men in the world and that the United States is, you know, one of the most, is a military superpower, that they do have nuclear weapons themselves. They have used it before, by the way. And they are trying to teach the world a lesson, which lesson we're not quite sure what.
But Ms. Shakdam, that is exactly the world we are facing. I mean, when you say dangerous, yeah, it is dangerous. And that has been going on for quite some time, as we could recall. So that could be also still the logic continuing, even regarding the Iranian nuclear deal. So what would that mean, since you're based in Brighton? Tell me about, is this going to be the dividing force between the United States and its allies in Europe, or eventually, after all of this apparent harsh debate, the allies going to come together with the United States and say, oh, well, maybe a renegotiation?
I think it's going to be a difficult one, and only because, you know, if the US was to renege on the deal, then it would essentially put European countries at odds with America, in the sense that by continuing to engage with Iran, they would be violating American law and American sanctions. So it would be very difficult then for the EU and the UK, for example, to then engage diplomatically, politically, economically with the US. And I don't think that Mr. Trump actually, you know, weighed that in when he kind of made his political equation. thinking that automatically his partners, the EU and the UK, would align with his decision. It's not as simple as that. And I think that French President Macron actually made a really good point when he was saying that, we need to be very careful how we move forward, because there's an intertwining of, interests that is not so easily, disconnected. So it's going to be quite difficult. And I think it's going to be a very hard sell for the US, as it's going to isolate them very much.
Will a deal still work, Mr. Rubin, if the U.S. decides to withdraw?
The deal technically could still work, but the United States, if we withdraw and reimpose sanctions, that means that the United States would reimpose sanctions likely on Europe and European countries whose companies are engaging in business with Tehran. So it could in theory, but it would be expecting quite a lot. And it's such a high risk. Really, going back to the core point, this is a decision that ultimately the president alone can make. And you're right, despite all of the pressures here in Washington, Congress and the media and public opinion, this deal was constructed where the president had ultimate authority, because at the time, Republicans in Congress deeply opposed the nuclear agreement that President Obama signed, and so he could not get anything strong through the Congress. So we're now in this paradoxical position where President Trump has unilateral authority, but if he unwinds it and it breaks, there is no plan for the day after as far as what arrangements or diplomacy we would engage in then. And that's the deep fear here in Washington.
Mr. Li, here in China, we are discussing this right before a possibility of a summit between North Korea and the United States. The first time ever in decades. Does it help us, what is going on right now, about no evidence reaching a conclusion to scrap off a historic deal, to China, which is, of course, very concerned about the security situation in Northeast Asia, particularly the DPRK nuclear issue? Is this going to ring an alarm bell? What does it mean for the future, if there is any negotiation process?
I think, so far China, together with, the other parties like Russia, EU3 countries, and try, to pressurize or persuade U.S. President Trump to stay in the nuclear deal. And I believe that as many, the Trump administration officials have said that, President Trump has not decided yet what he may say by the end of the day. So there is a possibility that maybe, he just announced on certain conditions that, the United States still may, maybe stay in, the nuclear deal for certain times, demanded, certain, itineraries or certain conditions would be met. Let the Europeans to do the work. I think, if, the United States leave the nuclear deal, that it will be very, very hard, I personally believe that, for Trump to make a deal with the North Korea.
Right. Well, before we go, I do also want to have your opinion, 30 seconds if you can, from both Ms. Shakdam and also Mr. Rubin. Ms. Shakdam first. Worst scenario?
Well, I think Iran will. I think Iran is already making provision, in view of the nuclear deal being reneged. And I don't think it bodes very well for the future of the Middle East, because it would mean that there would be further tension and that we're standing the risk of having war by proxies. Because I don't see a military engagement in between the US and Iran, but, it's a possibility.
Mr. Rubin, worst scenario,
worst case scenario. Yes, please. Worst case scenario is that if the deal is terminated, that Iran begins to enrich uranium once again and enrich it up to levels just at about enough grade for a nuclear weapon, and begins to stockpile to dare the international community to pay attention to it again and to extract concessions for some future negotiation. But that does run deep risks, and it's possible that President Trump will react very negatively to that as well. And that's what we're all hoping to avoid.
We don't want the history to be repeated once again. For now, I want to thank the four of you for being with us, especially our appreciation to Mr. Gambar Naderi from Iran to coming to this discussion. Meanwhile, Catherine Shakdam, Joe Rubin, Legal Fu, thank you so much for being with us. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program.